So last week I got the idea to make a series of tournaments on the channel, which basically consists of a bunch of different polls on a bunch of different topics, and then people would vote on them, and then they would go up in the tournament to see what is the best of whatever. It's just a little something that I thought would be entertaining for people in between each of my videos coming out. And the first tournament I decided to do was a Smash tournament involving all comic book characters. And if you don't know what a Smash tournament is, I suggest you walk away from the washing machine, take out your phone, call your brother or father, ask them, and they'll explain it to you. During the tournament, I started to notice that all of the non-Marvel and DC characters were just absolutely fucking throttling all of the other characters. And to me, it's pretty obvious as to why this is happening. It's not because all these non-Marvel DC characters are just worse characters than the Marvel DC ones. It's because no one knows who they are. So I thought this would be a really good opportunity for me to shed some light on some lesser known comic book characters, talk a little bit about who they are, the series they come from, a bit of their history, and possibly some comic book recommendations. And if you find any of them interesting, maybe you can look them up and read the books, because some of them are genuinely good characters and deserve a lot better than they've gotten from the public. So let's get started. First up, we got a twofer in Hell Witch and Lady Death. These two lovely ladies come from the Coffin verse, made by Coffin Comics. The best way I can describe Coffin Comics by taking a heavy metal album cover and then just turning that into a comic series. It is bloody, sexy, and metal as hell. And Lady Death and Hell Witch are the two premier characters of the universe. Lady Death was once a little girl named Hope who made a deal with the demon to give up all her humanity so she wouldn't have to go through a certain horrible fate. For a long time in the comics, she was a villain whose whole goal was to eliminate all life on Earth because of a curse given her by Lucifer that said that she couldn't leave hell as long as there was life on Earth. But that was a long time ago, and she does get a redemption arc. Nowadays, she's a hero that lives in hell and fights against the forces of darkness to protect humanity from them. And her comics are basically about her being the only good person in hell, where she goes around saving people, helping people, trying to better the world, fighting demons, and looking like this while she's doing it. On the flip side, you got Hell Witch. Now, Hell Witch is a member of a race called the Hellborn, who are essentially a group of demons who are born in hell, obviously. The Hellborn society is based on a caste system, and Hell Witch was born in the lowest caste, essentially slaves. Her story is about her breaking those chains, acquiring power, and fighting her way up to basically controlling and becoming the queen of all Hellborn. She is a very cruel, vicious, and evil character, as opposed to Lady Death, who's a good guy. Now, the thing that makes these character stories and Coffin Comics as a whole very, very appealing is that they don't care about any modern sensibilities. They're a modern comic that just throws away all that stuff. They are unbelievably over-the-top gory, they're incredibly over-sexualized, and the things that the characters do and say are just things that you would not see happen in something like a Marvel or DC comic where everything is very sanitized. The writers of Coffin Comics do not care about your sensitivities, and they are trying to make a heavy metal album cover into a comic, and that is what they have done successfully. There is some straight up foul shit that happened in this comic, and I'm saying that as a positive. If seeing two demon women 69ing before being attacked by an army of monsters, then fighting those army of monsters and having sex again in their bloody corpses is not something that's appealing to you, this might not be your cup of tea. However, if you're really into things like Doom, Berserk, or Judge Dredd, this might actually be up your alley. At worst, these comics can be described as fun schlock, and at best, they're actually pretty decent stories. And the themes of those stories generally revolve around very universal concepts. Vengeance, ambition, love, right and wrong. Things that classic stories are usually about. And both Hell Witch and Lady Death are relatively well-written characters. And another really good selling point for the comic is it's a relatively new company with a new universe that they've made. So you don't have to worry about siphoning through thousands upon thousands of comics trying to figure out where to start. It's a connected universe, but each of the characters don't really have that many comics as of yet. And the story of all of these comics within that universe are all watched over by one person. So you don't have things like retcons and continuity errors and all the stuff that you would have in like a Marvel or DC comic. As of right now, everything is very clear and easy to understand and easy to get into. Alright, next up is Ballistic and Velocity. When I was choosing characters for this tournament, I was actually trying to get a large variety from a bunch of different universes. And while doing this, I completely forgot that Ballistic and Velocity are from the same team in the same universe. They're actually sisters. See, they're originally from a Top Cow comic called Cyberforce, which I never read. I did read both of their standalone comics, but it just slipped my mind that these two were related and on the same team. So the list was not as varied as I would have liked it to be. But you know what? If you don't like it, you ain't got no one to blame but yourself. I made a community post asking people what kind of characters I should put in a tournament, and I only got like 3 comments, all of which told me I should put Storm in it. Storm was already in the fucking tournament. If y'all wanted a more varied list, y'all should have messaged me when I gave y'all the chance. Right now, I'm setting up a new swordsman tournament, so go to the community post and type in what swordsman you want me to put in the tournament. Because if not, I'm just going to do swordsmen that I know of, and we're going to run into this problem yet again. Anyway, who are Ballistic and Velocity? They're both characters on a team called Cyberforce, which, like I said before, I never really read too much. It's basically Top Cow's version of the X-Men, and a lot of the characters on there are very similar to the X-Men. Like, one of the characters on the team's name is Cyblade, who is basically identical to Psylocke, but I don't know if you can consider that a ripoff, because the creator of Cyblade was a Marvel writer who created Psylocke, and after he left, he joined Top Cow, and then he wanted to write for Psylocke, but no longer had the rights to her, so just created Cyblade and the Cyberforce, which was basically just like the X-Men. I don't know if you can necessarily say that the man ripped off himself, but it is what it is. Anyway, Ballistic is no different when it comes to this. She's very similar to Wolverine in a lot of ways. They both were brain brainwashed into doing very horrible things in the past, only to forget all of that time, and then become heroes later on with amnesia. The difference is, and the thing that I like about Ballistic, is how they go about getting her memories back. It's very different than what they did with Wolverine. See, when Wolverine eventually does get his memories back, it doesn't really affect him all that much. He doesn't change as a character. He's basically just Wolverine still, but now he knows more stuff. Ballistic's storyline really takes advantage of the whole concept of forgetting all this horrible shit you did. She starts off the story as a very basic 90s bad girl. She doesn't have a whole lot that makes her unique in terms of 90s action heroes. That is until she gets her memories back. Unlike Wolverine, she's actually greatly affected when she finds out all the horrible things that she's done. The guilt really eats at her, and it completely changes her character from that point on. She becomes an alcoholic. She gets very heavily into drugs. She starts having sex with a bunch of people who she knows is bad for her. She gets into very dangerous and damaging relationships, all for the purposes of punishing herself for all the horrible things that she had done in the past that weren't really her fault. She's a very tragic and sad character. In a lot of ways, Top Cow dealt with her backstory in a much better way than Wolverine did with theirs. My only real issue with this character is that the massive majority of her story is in Cyberforce, where she plays a side character. She had her own title that was one 4-issue miniseries, but that's it. Other than that, if you want to read anything about her, you have to read Cyberforce. I've heard some good things about Cyberforce, some bad things about Cyberforce, but the one thing that I've heard on both good and bad is that it's basically an X-Men clone. You know what? Fuck this. This is bullshit. I've never made a video about a comic that doesn't have a show or TV adaptation to it. So it's usually pretty easy to get footage for this shit, but none of these have that. So I'm basically going around the internet finding hundreds and hundreds of fucking images so I could fill up this whole 20-something minute long video. No, fuck that. I ain't doing that no more. I mean, you should see my goddamn desktop. It's just filled with pictures. This is taking forever. Anytime I get tired of searching for images for this video, I'm just gonna put, I don't know, videos of puppies. That's nice, right? Everybody loves puppies. Cool? Cool. Now, her younger sister Velocity is a little bit different. She's from Cyberforce 2, but she did get her own solo series, and that solo series was not a miniseries, like it ran for quite some time. And her character's also very interesting like Ballistics. It's a pretty basic yet well done coming of age story, where Velocity starts the story as a teenager and then goes through all the normal teenage stuff until she eventually becomes an adult and grows into a hero that she's going to be. It's your classic coming of age superhero story like Spider-Man or Static Shock. One of the things I really like about the way her character is written is that her super speed is taken very literally. It's extremely realistic the way it's written. So if you were to read DC Comics and look at someone like the Flash, what he does is move himself through time and space any way he wants to, but it's not genuine speed. So he can run by people and through buildings and all sorts of things without actually affecting anything around him. Velocity can't do that. Velocity's power is shown as realistic, true world super speed. And this makes it pretty interesting. Despite the fact that she can run pretty much as fast as she wants to, she has to constantly be aware of just how fast she's running, who's in the area, or what's in the area. Like, she can't run past innocent civilians going 1,000 miles per hour, or else just the shock of her running by them will make them fling into nearby buildings. She can't go Mach 5 across an empty desert because she might blow up enough dust to make a fucking sandstorm and destroy a nearby town. She has to be very careful with how she uses her super speed, and this makes her extremely paranoid about her powers, and she really doesn't like using them all that often. It's even been said in the comics on multiple occasions that she's capable of running fast enough to destroy the entire planet. This fear of using her powers is a really big part of her character, and I do like it quite a bit. If you want to read up on either of these characters, you can check out the Cyberforce series, Velocity series, or Ballistics spin-off series. Both are really good characters. I can't really recommend Cyberforce because I haven't actually read it, but most of Top Cow's comics are pretty good, so I imagine it's probably not bad. Just be aware what you're getting into. It's basically an X-Men series. Okay, so Suprema is the one where I started calling bullshit on the voting. This is the most one-sided vote of all the matches, and it should have been, but it should have been in the other direction. Suprema is a genuinely good person. There's no way in hell anyone who voted for Black Cat read either a Black Cat comic or a Suprema comic. Black Cat is an atrociously toxic person. I mean, she's really a piece of shit. There's no other way to say it. You know how in the first Spider-Man PS4 game there was that DLC where she shows up and lies to Peter about having a kid with her so he would help her do some shit that she wanted to do? Yeah, that's pretty accurate to how she's written in the comic. At one point in the comic, she seduces Peter, and then after she sleeps with him and he falls asleep, she steals his blood and then sells it on the black market. After he finds out about this, he confronts her and she gaslights the fuck out of him, somehow making him feel bad about it and like he's overreacting about her literally stealing his blood while he slept to sell it on the black market. She is always written as a lying, manipulative, gaslighting bitch. And it's crazy to me that anyone would pick her over Suprema. And you can't even say that you picked her because she looks better, because her and Suprema almost look like the same person with different clothes. The only reason why people voted for Black Cat is because they know the name. That's it. They don't know the character, because you wouldn't have voted for her if you knew the character. Suprema, on the other hand, is essentially written to be the perfect woman. She's selfless, caring, loving, tries to help everyone around her, even her villains. She's definitely the kindest person on this list and would probably make the best waifu out of any of them. At one point in her story, a villain known as the Living Galaxy arrives to Earth looking for a wife and threatens to destroy all of the Milky Way if he doesn't find someone. Suprema offers herself to marry him and then goes away into this dark black hole thing for 30 years where time is essentially damn near frozen, so it feels like an eternity. She becomes this man's slave wife for what feels like thousands of years. Eventually, when Supreme arrives on Earth and realizes what has happened, he goes to find her. And he does. He frees her. And when he's about to put an ass whooping on the Living Galaxy because he can, she tells him no, because over the time her being there, she realized that the only reason why he's doing this is because he's lonely and he misses his people who he has been separated from for millennia. So despite the horrible things that he did to her, she still helped him go off and find his people. He's so grateful for this that he becomes a permanent ally of Earth and basically gives her a favor that she can ask anything of him at any time. That is the level of kindness and care that we're talking about exists within this character. She's probably the best example of a true altruist. She doesn't care about moral alignment, race, creed, any of that such nonsense. All she cares about is always doing what's right for every individual that she comes across. And while I certainly wouldn't make the decisions that she does, and I would even argue that those decisions would be a bit naive at times, there's no doubt that she's a genuinely good person and a good hero. And her comics are actually pretty decent. Now, she does have her own Suprema comic, but she's mostly known from her much more famous Brothers Supreme comic, as well as the Youngblood comic where she's a member of a team. And the concept of these comics are actually really cool. So basically, the Supreme universe is extremely meta. Anything that happens outside in the real world to the comic also happens within the universe and is explained in the universe as having happened. And this leads to some pretty cool forms of storytelling. For instance, the Supreme comic has been rebooted twice, and the continuity has been changed multiple times. Every time this happens, it happens within the story. So when Supreme gets retconned and he shows up as a totally different character, he sees it happening and he's aware of it happening and he reacts to it appropriately. If something within the continuity changes, he points it out. And it's not like Deadpool where he points at it and laughs and makes a joke about it. It's taken very seriously in the comic. The whole story kind of builds up to this possibility that there's some kind of god who's altering events based on the way that they want it to be altered. And there's some kind of sinister motivation there. And how this affects the story is really fucking cool. Like, Supreme's villain Dax believes that the entire Supreme universe only exists so that they can fight for somebody's entertainment, which obviously that's true. The only reason that the comic exists is so that we could see Supreme fight against his villains for the entertainment of the readers. At one point, Supreme goes into this alternate universe called Supremacy, where he sees all the previous retconned versions of himself who are still alive, having no idea why they were removed from the story and just tossed in this random limbo world. Even the smaller stuff that don't have massive story implications are pretty damn cool. Supreme and his love interest in the story are actually comic book writers. At one point, they go on a date and they start talking to each other about a comic book that they're currently writing where two characters are going on a date. They start talking to each other about how the date's going to go in the comic and why certain events within the date will happen in the comic for story reasons. But the issue of that comic, which is a date between these two, goes the exact same way that they describe their in-comic date will go. Does that make sense? Yeah, that makes sense. It's really one of the coolest ways I've ever seen a meta story be done in a comic book. Now, there are some downsides to Suprema and the comic as a whole. For one, the comic doesn't have an ending. It was eventually canceled and the story was just kind of left open-ended. That's going to bother a lot of people. It sure as shit bothers me. It's one of the reasons why I never really got that far into the comic in the first place. She is written to be the perfect woman, but even the perfect woman has some flaws. Main one being that she is so good and she is so righteous that she does come off as self-righteous sometimes, and she annoys people within the story with just how good and pure and great she is. She's not arrogant or cocky, but she knows right from wrong, and she holds her opinions very strongly. And she does see herself as morally superior to most people. But in her defense, she is morally superior to most people. So it is what it is. Okay, now we're getting to the part of the list where we get to cover characters that I really, really like. The next two characters, I highly, highly recommend that you go read their comics, because these are some great characters with some really good stories. First one we're going to talk about is Cassie Hack. She's from a comic called Hack Slash, and this one is cool just conceptually. At the beginning of the story, Cassie's in high school and she's kind of a loser. She gets picked on, she's bullied constantly, and she just wasn't having a very good time in high school. But, I mean, were any of us. Her mother was a lunch lady for the school and very overprotective, and basically decided to poison all the bullies in the school. Bit of an overreaction, but okay. People found out about this pretty much instantly, and this eventually leads to her attempted arrest and death. But then she comes back to life as a superpowered zombie serial killer, and Cassie decides to take it upon herself to basically re-kill her mother. After this, Cassie decides not to stick around because she doesn't want to be in a small town being known as the daughter of the serial killer who she had to murder. So she just gets in her car and leaves. And that's like the first issue of the comic. From that point on, the series follows Cassie as she goes from city to city fighting other beings just like her mother. These people are called slashers, and they're basically all inspired by slashers from horror movies, like slasher horror movies. Jason, Freddy Krueger, Victor Crowley, you name it. And that's the whole series in a nutshell. Every arc, she goes to a new town, finds a new slasher, and has to deal with it. One of the major selling points for this series are the massive abundance of crossovers that exist within it. I mean, it's fucking insane just how many people they can get in this series. You name it. If they're a horror icon, they've probably appeared in this comic at some point. Cassie has probably fought and even killed them. But if your whole thing is only reading the crossover comics of this series, you're really missing out because this is a really well done series. For one, the original slasher villains are all pretty unique and interesting, and a part of the fun is just seeing what the next slasher is going to be and what kind of crazy powers it's going to have. But also, the main reason why you want to follow the series is because of Cassie herself. Cassie's just a really great main character for a series like this. She's entertaining and fun to read about while actually having a lot of depth. You see, when Cassie's doing her murder thing and she's fighting these slasher villains, she's very confident and funny, and she says one-liners, and she almost seems like a Buffy the Vampire Slayer or Ashley Williams type character. But the comic makes it very clear that outside of fighting slashers, she's really not capable of functioning in everyday life. There's a reason why she was bullied so badly in high school. She's kind of a weirdo, and she has no idea how to interact with other people, and relationships are completely foreign to her. And this is a really big part of her character that is explored in depth in the series. And the question that the series asks time and time again is she actually better off having this lifestyle where she travels around fighting monsters than she would if she was just living a normal life? Is she only fighting these monsters because she knows that she cannot function normally? Is she really doing this because she wants to help people and she likes this lifestyle? Or is there really no other option for her? Now, when I made the poll with her, I knew she was going to lose because no one knows who the fuck she is. But I thought she'd do a lot better just based on the fact that she was a big titty goth chick. I mean, her design is fantastic, but I think if more people actually read her comic, which again is really well done, they would really fall in love with who she is as a person and her story as a whole. It's really good at building up sympathy for her and kind of feeling sorry for her in a lot of ways. She feels vulnerable and fragile emotionally when it comes to certain relationships, but it never takes away from the fact that when she's in an actual fight, she knows what the fuck she's doing. It's a really cool dichotomy to read about. If what I've said has interested you, check out Hack Slash. Great series, great read. Especially if you're a horror movie fan. If you're a horror movie fan and you don't read this, you're robbing yourself of a seriously cool experience. Alright, just let me say right off the bat, Witchblade is my absolute favorite female superhero of all time in comics. So obviously I'm a bit biased here. Like, if it was up to me, she would win the tournament. Hands down, it wouldn't even be close. Sarah Pazzini is a cop who one day does a bust on this illegal auction where they're selling off a bunch of stolen relics. And while she's there, she runs into the Witchblade, which is an ancient weapon that can only be wielded by people who are considered worthy. Specifically women. Witchblade doesn't attach itself to men. So it attaches itself to her, and then she ends up using this weapon, which is the greatest weapon in the entire universe, to fight off all kind of beings from demons to aliens to all kinds of other stuff. And that's really all I'm going to tell you about what it's about. The series is really long and gets into some very complicated shit. It starts dealing with alternate dimensions and gods and destruction of the universe and recreation of the universe, alternate realities, all kinds of crazy comic book shit. As far as the universe's story are concerned, if you like Top Cow comics like The Darkness, you're gonna like Witchblade. Witchblade and The Darkness are hands down the best comics that Top Cow had ever written, and the two have crossovers quite a bit. They're actually pretty closely linked together. But the real selling point to this comic is Sarah Pazzini herself. She is a very unique and well-written character. If I describe her to you, I'd say that she's basically Axel Foley meets Judge Dredd in the body of a super hot green-eyed Italian woman. Her character has a lot in common with those 1980s take-no-nonsense type of cops. You know, the kind of characters who constantly go against the orders of their police captain to then catch their man anyway. Just for the police captain to say some shit like, "You're a loose cannon, Sarah, but you're the best cop on the force." Yeah, she's that kind of character. But one of the defining features of her character is the fact that she sees the world in a very black and white way. Much like characters like Judge Dredd or the Punisher. But unlike stories like the Punisher, where they clearly show that as a bad thing and only a bad thing, the story of Witchblade is a lot more nuanced and actually shows that there are positives and negatives to this outlook. Early on in the story, they introduce this woman who's in charge of her own modeling company, and she ends up abusing and torturing and doing all kinds of horrible things to the models, even sacrificing them and doing all kinds of shit like that for power. And the story goes out of its way to show how horrible her backstory is. This woman who was abusing people was actually greatly abused herself. She was mentally, emotionally, and physically abused by an ex-husband, and the story really leans in on this to try and make her her a sympathetic character. When Sarah and her eventually face off in the story and Sarah finds out about this horrible past that she had, you expect her to act like pretty much any other superhero does, with sympathy towards this villain. But the thing that makes Sarah Pazzini is that she does not give a fuck. She essentially calls this villain a whiner who's using her own pain to cause pain to others. She beats the ever-loving shit out of this villain. Clearly could not care less about any of the problems that she's had. She's not here to fix her at all. And this is sort of the way Sarah goes through pretty much the entirety of her storyline. She is called out a couple of times for this mindset, but the way Sarah views the world is that everyone has a duty and responsibility to act appropriately, to behave responsibly and act lawfully. She doesn't care about your excuses. She doesn't care about why you're doing it. She has no sympathy for Robin Hood type characters. If you're a bad guy and you're doing something that's against the law, Sarah Pazzini will find you and she will take you down. And she does it while having a pretty good sense of humor and saying a lot of 1980s one-liners. And the story in a lot of ways is what happens when you give a character like this unlimited godlike power, because that's what the Witchblade is. It's insanely powerful. At one point in the comics, it takes on the entire Justice League and one-shots like 90% of them, including Superman. Now, my description for this story sounds a little bit rushed. That's because it kind of is, and that's going to lead us to the bad parts of it. It has a very slow start. A lot of people stop reading Witchblade within the first 30 or so issues, and I think that's a mistake because eventually it does get very, very good. But the start of the story, other than Sarah Pazzini, because she is interesting even from the start, is pretty basic. It's really just her going through the motions of fighting different villains that come up and trying to discover how this new power that she has works. It isn't until later in the story where they really start to get into more crazy, like, artifact type shit where it gets really interesting, and Sarah comes into her own as a wielder of the Witchblade. And unlike a lot of the other characters on this list, Sarah actually has a lot of comics. I own like the first 3 omnibuses, and there are several more to acquire. It's a really long story, so if you're looking for something that's going to actually last you quite a while, this might be something worth checking out. And if that's not enough of a selling point, every time she summons the Witchblade armor, it rips all her clothes off, so you know, that's a cool addition. So the last characters on this list I put last because they're the characters I know the least about. For each of these, I read either very little of it or just nothing at all. So I wasn't really comfortable enough to straight up recommend these. But I will tell you a little bit about what I know, and if it sounds interesting to you, look it up and check it out yourself. The first one's going to be Aspen Matthews. Now, a lot of people think that this character is a ripoff of Aquaman, but I think that that's not really fair. She does have water powers, although arguably she has more water powers than Aquaman does. Like, she can turn into water, and she controls water, and she can control ice and steam, and create ice and steam and create water out of thin air. Like, she does have more powers. But outside of her being from a race of underwater creatures who also goes underwater and fights villains and stuff, she's not a superhero, and she's not a queen of Atlantis or anything like that. In her comic called Fathom, there's 2 races of underwater creatures. There's the blacks and the blues. Aspen is a child of a black and a blue, which is supposed to be forbidden. They're not allowed to have kids together. They're enemies, and they've been warring for as long as they've existed. This makes Aspen incredibly powerful, but she really doesn't want to have anything to do with the blues or the blacks. She's a marine biologist and an underwater explorer. She's essentially like an underwater Laura Croft. The war between the blues and the blacks are something that they keep trying to drag her into because whatever side she's on is the side that they believe will win. But she has no interest in it, and they kind of keep trying to pull her in against her will. This is essentially what the comic is about. It's essentially Laura Croft underwater with a civil war happening that she doesn't want to have any part of, but that keeps dragging her in. That's the story of Aspen Matthews. Although it should be noted that I did not put her on the list because I know a lot about her. I put her on the list because that's what she looks like. This character is gorgeously drawn. She looks really good. And it's crazy to me that someone could look at a character with this design and be like, nah, she deserves to lose in the first round. That makes no sense. Next is Deja Thoris. So I actually broke my own rule on accident when I put this character on the tournament. The tournament was supposed to be comic book characters who were created for comics. Like, I wasn't doing manga or anime characters. I wasn't doing video game characters that also appeared in comics. I was doing specifically comic created characters. Deja Thoris is from a book that was then adapted into a comic. So I broke my rule, but it was accidental because I forgot that she was in a book. You know that Disney movie that came out years ago, John Carter and something of Mars or whatever? That movie's based on a book that Deja Thoris is a part of, but I didn't know about the book. I knew about the comic, so I've always known this character as a comic character. And the comic is called Warlord of Mars. It's basically about John Carter being the king of Mars, dealing with the other factions of Mars. Deja Thoris is his wife and queen, and she's pretty cool. I've only read a couple issues of this comic, but if I had to describe it, it would basically be like a sci-fi Conan, I guess. Sort of. Once again, Deja was added to the list not because I know a lot about her, but because she looks like this. She looks good. What can I say? Again, kind of crazy she was wiped out in the first round. I don't get it. She looks good. All right, the last character is the only character on the list that I don't know anything about whatsoever. I've never read a single issue of this comic, and the only thing I know about her is stuff that I've read places or that people have told me. I know her name is Dawn. I know she started up as a pinup girl that then became a character because people really liked her design. I know that she's a goddess of rebirth, and she exists in a world where all gods exist at the same time. Norse, Egyptian, Egyptian, Greek, Christianity. I know she fought Satan at one point. That's about it. I really don't know much else about her. Oh, she's also the leader of witches on Earth, I think. I read that somewhere. And before this video, I tried to look online, see if I can find out some information, and there's very little out there. I don't know how popular this comic was, but apparently the design of Dawn was the thing that blew up, not the comic itself. And I have to admit, it is a pretty unique design. I do like the design of Dawn, and that's really the only reason why she was on the list. If this very vague description is something that you're interested in, check her out, but I can't recommend her either way, because I don't know much about her. And that's it. That's all the forgotten characters from the tournament. There were a couple of Marvel and DC characters that were also losing the tournament, but I'm not doing any of them because everybody knows Marvel and DC characters. They're not really forgotten. I thought about putting Punchline on here too, since not that many people know about her, but she's not forgotten. She's just brand new, and she's going to build more of a following as the years go by. She's probably even gonna get her own movie at some point, knowing how WB does things. And that's gonna be it. That's the video. Remember, if you haven't voted on the tournament, go vote on it. It's still up right now, depending on when you watch this video. If I change your mind on a particular vote, let me know. If you've decided to try out one of these comics, let me know. Comment below what you think about these characters, we could talk about them. And remember to like, subscribe, hit that little bell icon if you want notifications, because you're not going to get them if you don't hit the bell icon. And y'all be safe out there, you hear?